Assalamu alaikum. When people hear of Palestine, the main facts they know about Palestine is the Palestinian flag, the occupation, and the hope of a free Palestine. But of course, there is much more to the story. This is an informative, hopefully, presentation, Palestine Remembered by me, Ahmed. It's a very long struggle. And there was a story narrated in Gada Karmi's book that two Jewish rabbis were sent by one of the Zionist organizations to explore the option of establishing a homeland for the Jews in Palestine in late 18-ish. So after a while, they send a letter back saying the bride is beautiful, but she's married to another man. So, where do you want to start with this story? We start with the recent history, and I will define milestones. We'll go through the history of the conflict. The two most important milestones, 1948 and 1967, but there are other milestones on other sides of that. And one of the most famous, iconic things about the conflict that's most widely spread is the disappearing Palestine map, which I have some reservations about some of the factual errors about it, but I will address that as we go. But it is a good point as a reference point to what we're talking about. So identifying the milestones, we will talk about what happened in reference to these milestones in narratives of the things that happened, that took place. I'll revisit these milestones explaining how it happened. And finally, I'll revisit that again to highlight why it happened, why this took place. A good starting point is 1917, when Jerusalem, under the Ottoman rule, surrendered to the British Army, and the British Army occupied Palestine. This was in December 1917. December 1917, Palestine fell under the British occupation and became a British colony or under the British mandate. December 1917. November 1917, a month before the occupation of Jerusalem, the Balfour Declaration, November 1917, 2nd of November 1917, the British government made the Balfour Declaration that it promised to help the Jewish people to establish a homeland in Palestine, and issued that to the Zionist organizations at the time. And the argument was used by the many Zionists then and now that a land without people for people without a land. But Palestine was not a land without people. Palestine was a land full of people, a civilized society. 1935, a school for blind children in Hebron. Not just a normal school for blind children. Blind children in Hebron in Palestine could attend school in 1935, when in this day and age, millions of children around the world, not blind, normal children, able-bodied, can't attend schools. Many other pictures, 1933, Arab Medical Conference in Palestine, primary schools in Palestine, libraries in Palestine, high streets in Palestine. 1908, football match in Jerusalem, that's during the Ottoman rule. It was a civil society, it was a developed society, it was an advanced society living in Palestine. Under the British rule, under the British mandate from 1917 onwards, Britain allowed and encouraged and facilitated Jewish immigration from Europe, from all over the world, well, at the time it was mainly Europe, to Palestine. So the ships were coming and the Jewish population of Palestine was increased, the immigration facilitated by the different agencies and supported and made easy by the British mandate in Palestine, increased exponentially the Jewish population in Palestine. So between 1917, the population of Palestine was around 700,000 or 900,000, depending on different estimates. The Jewish population at the time was 15,000. 15,000 Jews lived in Palestine at the time. By 1947, that number, because of immigration, increased to around 500,000. So exponential increase. However, that number, they represented 1/3 of the population by that time, even less than that. And the UN proposed a plan known as the Partition Plan, the UN resolution to partition Palestine between the Jews and the Arabs. And important to note that the Arabs, not the Muslims, the Arabs, the Palestinians, the original Palestinians, that's Muslims, Christians, Druze, Baha'is, different dominations, Armenians. There was so many, Shashanian, so many ethnicities in Palestine. They were all considered as one group, and the Jews were the second group. The partition gave the 50% of the land to the Jewish population and 50% of the land to the Arab population. And it was proposed to both parties. For the Zionist organizations, that wasn't the dream. That's not what they came for. They came in for the whole thing. They didn't want part of it. The Arabs at the time, they had 94% of the land were Arab land. The Jews at the time controlled 6% of the land, or owned 6% of the land. And they felt, we can't accept that. That's nonsense. Hence, the Arabs rejected the plan. Once the Arab rejected the plan, and it's this very important detail here, once the Arab rejected the plan, the Zionist organizations accepted the plan. Few hours later, they accepted the plan. They opposed the plan, they didn't want it, but once they knew the plans will not be implemented because the Arabs refusing it, they accepted the plan. Very tactful. And that's why you see it in the maps. But this never was a reality, never anywhere close to representing reality. And it is a big misconception. So the second biggest milestone in this journey is 1948. 1948 was known as the year of the Nakba for the Palestinians, the catastrophe. Israel came into existence as a state. The British withdrew from Palestine. It was the 1948 war, and Israel declared its independence. And to achieve that independence, an important thing has to happen, which was the ethnic cleansing of all the land that came in under the rule of Israel. The dots you see here, it's too small to magnify. The point is, all these were towns, villages, cities that demolished by the Zionist Haganah and Argan and all sort of organizations that commenced the ethnic cleansing and changed the demographics of the newborn state, the state of Israel. So 1949, the ceasefire line, this what became known as Israel, an independent state on this part of the land, and the remaining parts of Palestine, which was the West Bank, became part of Jordan, entered into some sort of unity with the Jordanian state and became all part of Jordan. And Gaza came under Egypt ruling. So they managed the Gaza Strip. And for reasons that I don't understand, I can't explain to anybody because I can't explain something I don't understand. And it's one of the I personally think was one of the catastrophic mistakes that a Palestinian state was not declared on the remaining parts of the land. But yeah, we'll talk about more in not this particular point, but more on the catastrophic mistakes that happened in regards to managing Palestinian issue as we go on why it happened. The following milestone is 1967, where the 1967 Six Days War, 5th of June, broke out, and Israel went into war with Jordan, with Egypt, with Syria, and Iraq had army. There were different armies involved in the conflict at the time, and Israel won. Amazing. So Israel went into conflict with all these countries at the same time, and it's called the Six Days War, generous term. But after the war, and Israel winning the war, Israel went into occupying all of Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and of course the Gaza Strip. Israel before the war the area of Israel, or what's historically preoccupied Palestine, was 22,000 square kilometers. The Sinai Peninsula is 60,000 square kilometers. So, yeah, don't know what to say, but credit where credit is due. So many other things happened between 1967 to 1987. Um, the Battle of Karama, the October War, the Lebanon invasion. So a lot of changes, a lot of things happening. But for the Palestinian struggle, I will, as I said, I focus on the main milestones defining the Palestinian struggle. And the Intifada 1987 was one of these milestones, one important milestones. The Intifada, the Palestinians in an organized or unorganized way in December 1987 started throwing stones at the occupying forces in Gaza and the West Bank, and things started to escalate and then continued. It was throwing stones faced with tear gas, rubber bullets, live bullets, torture, detentions, all sorts of things happening against the Palestinian population. Sharon, who was, sorry, not Sharon, Shamir, who was at the time, I think, was the Israeli prime minister, said he was in a press conference externally. He said, oh, we'll go back. It's going to be a matter of 2 days and it will stop. And 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 years, and it continued till early 1993. And this is why it is a milestone, because it redefined the struggle. It took a part of civil disobedience with active resistance to the occupation, and it continued, and it drew the world attention again to the issue of Palestine in a different way. The peace talks between Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, Arafat, and the Israeli government started early in 1991, 1992, the Madrid Conference, then there was the Oslo Accords, and eventually the famous handshake in Washington, 1993. Peace deal was struck. A new era has started for the conflict. Of course, that resulted in negotiations and negotiations. And 28 years later, we're still negotiating, and we're negotiating what to negotiate and how to negotiate. Endless processes. And important to note, because Palestinians accepted concessions, a lot of concessions to come to terms to have a peace accord with the Israelis. The Israelis were giving also concessions from their side, and one of the main concessions they gave was Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli prime minister at the time, was assassinated by radical Jewish Zionists who perceived that he's letting go of the homeland, of the dream, and all of this. So they sabotaged the peace process. There were no real intentions among the Israeli right wing, who has been in control of the governments for the last 30 years or 20 years, or I don't know. You look it up. The very related milestone to that is this iconic photo of Muhammad al-Durra, who was killed during the Al-Aqsa Intifada, or the second Intifada in the year 2000. And This is a milestone for many, many political reasons, and one of the main reasons that it was a no-return point, because from that point onward, the whole peace process collapsed, the whole peace negotiations and deals, and any hope for a real Palestinian state has stopped. Ariel Sharon came into power in Israel. The Israeli policies completely radicalized the whole process of dealing with the Palestinians. And with this, in spite of the presence of the Palestinian Authority and all of that, we were living under occupation. 2005, Ariel Sharon decided to withdraw from Gaza. And this is a very important point because it's always highlighted that Gaza is not under occupation. Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, and that is very true, with a lot of caveats. 8,000 settlers were removed of Gaza, and the main reason for that happened because the cost of occupation became very expensive for the Israelis. So that's why they drew from Gaza. But knowingly that they can withdraw from Gaza, but they still can control the Gaza Strip. They control the water, they control the land borders from three sides, and leaving one side with the control of Egypt, who's very complicit in what's happening. And in 2007, the blockade was imposed, strict blockade on Gaza. That's in 2007, 14 years ago. In 2009 was the first war between Gaza and Israel, and Hamas and Jihad and different Palestinian factions used missiles, very primitive, very basic, but they used missiles to hit targets inside Israel. And that is a milestone because it changed the terms of the conflict. 2009, Israel accepted the peace, the ceasefire. 2014 was another, accepted the ceasefire. 2017 to 2021, which only a few days ago, and Israel accepted the ceasefire because there were change in power. Israel all the time will only accept the ceasefires on all the wars it launched against the Arabs, which it was in her interest to accept the ceasefire. Now it was a mutual agreement that we are hurting each other. We have to accept the ceasefire. We are both losing. So prior to 1947 and from the beginning of the British Mandate, the immigration was encouraged, they were facilitated, supported, and in certain cases enforced. And the Jewish population increased exponentially from a handful of Jews living in Palestine. Most of them were native Arabs to an extent, to massive immigration from all over the world, mainly Europe. So 1948, the war started, and to achieve what was the Israeli aim, to establish a homeland for the Jewish people, they had to accept that they have to adhere to certain things. And one of these things to change the demographics, because you can't have a Jewish state with majority of Arabs living in. So it was systematic destruction of villages, systematic disposition and forced immigration, and refugee ships filled in, or refugees filled in the ships and the borders across the Middle East, and more refugee camps were established across different areas to highlight the Palestinian diaspora and struggle from that day on. This is now interesting because you can look at this way on Wikipedia, the number of refugees. But if I may highlight one important factor, these are the refugees camps. So you can see refugee camps in Lebanon, refugee camps in Syria, refugee camps in Jordan. But there are a lot of refugee camps that were set up in the West Bank and refugee camps set up in Gaza. And that is very important because After the 1948, millions of Palestinians to this day lived in this diaspora. In the Gaza Strip, refugees, sons of refugees, daughters of refugees, who were born as refugees, living in refugee camps, the count now is 1.4 million. 1.4 million, and in the in the West Bank, over 800,000. And that signifies an important thing, that when we talk about the struggle for Palestinians around the world and the diaspora, the most biggest struggle, that they are refugees born under occupation. And that's one of the ironies of being a Palestinian. So you lost your homeland the first time, and you move to become a refugee to find yourself under a second form of occupation. For Palestine in 1948, most of the land was lost. 1967 was the second war, and Israel gained control of the West Bank and Gaza and became the Palestinian territories under occupation. And Palestinians, some of them were forced to leave, and some of them had to live under occupation. The Arab armies did a great job in defending the West Bank and Gaza. So this is the head of the Egyptian army surrendering, the Arab prisoners of war of different armies falling into to the hand of Israeli army, and the Jerusalem, the holy city, became all under the Israeli occupation. And of course, more immigration, more refugees, more people were moved and forced to move from their houses. Me, for example, my family from a village that was occupied in 1967, and it wasn't as bad as in 1948 in terms of demolition of villages, but our village, one of the few villages, were demolished in 1967, and everybody were forced to leave, were forced to move out of Palestine, and my family moved to Jordan, and because of technicalities and legal political terms, they're not classed as refugees. So all the numbers you talked about refugees, there are hundreds of thousands of people who were forced to leave in 1967, but because of technicalities and because it was all Jordan, they're not classed as refugees, they're classed as migrants. So different terminology and different political status. Disclaimer: why it happened. That's my interpretation for different things, my interpretation and highlights of different aspects as how it happened and why it took place and why it was facilitated. Subjective, I admit, you can skip this part. I think it's important to know what some people think. As I said, disclaimer, this is highly subjective. This is highly my opinion of certain things, how it did happen. The Palestinians knew after the British mandate, knew of the Balfour Declaration. The Arabs knew of the Balfour Declaration. It became common knowledge. And even without knowing about the document, the exponential increase in migration, Jewish migration, the facilitated migration by the British government, British mandate, made it obvious. The Palestinian land was at risk, and the Arabs knew that. 1935, Prince Saud bin Abdulaziz, Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia at the time, who later became the King of Saudi Arabia, visited Al-Quds, Jerusalem. And one of the Palestinian poets, Abdul Rahim Mahmoud, stood in the Holy Mosque and said to him, "Why are you here? Are you here to say farewell to the mosque? Because trust me, this is going to happen. We will lose this place." And it wasn't just emotional speech. That's what happened. They knew. The Arabs knew. The Arab leaders knew. The Arabs, leagues of all the Arab countries, everybody was aware of what's going on. And I leave it to you to explain why there was no interest in supporting it, supporting Palestinians, I mean. Of course, Palestinians took arms to defend their lands. There are a lot of folk songs talking about Palestinian women selling their jewelry so the man can buy a gun and go and defend the land. But there were caveats. There are a lot of caveats. Under British mandate, if you are an Arab caught with a gun, execution. If you caught with a bullet, that was enough justification for execution. If there was some resistance from certain villages, and there were stories about that and documented stories, certain villages, the British army will go crush the resistance, all the land, and confiscate any form of resistance, including kitchen knives. So women, if they want to cook something during the day, they have to go to a knife chained to a rock in the middle of the road so they can use it. It was harsh, it was brutal. So the Arab resistance had some weapons, had some sort of resistance plans. This is one of the leaders of resistance. And I probably, well, he was murdered, and most of them lost their lives defending Palestine. And that's what the sort of weapons they had to defend Palestine with. And that's what they had to fight. So the Palestinians had the primitive guns and gun machines, and they had to fight against this. And there was some support of the Arab League. They issued some forces, again, very, very much underfunded, very badly organized, and with so much bureaucracy to ensure they can't be effective in defending the Arabs in Palestine against the Zionist ambitions. Um, and as they say, uh, gun beats the spears. So this is 1967 now, and again, I'm very subjective here, and I'm not hiding this, and I'm very open about it. Prior to the 1967 war, June 1967, all the escalation for the war, all the preparation for the war, all the charging and galvanizing and provocative actions for the war were done by the Arabs, by the Arabic states. Syria, this is a cartoon. That was the narrative that the Arabs shared at the time. Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Saudi, Egypt, Algeria, and Sudan, all united in pointing the guns towards the Israelis and the Jews who we're going to throw in the sea. And that's what they used to chant in the radio stations for the regimes. We're going to throw them in the sea. And that's what the Jews used as a propaganda. Look, that's what they want to do. They want to throw us in the sea. Um, and Israel had to fight all of these countries by itself. So, and the galvanization, the charge, the emotions at the time was, it's a matter of an easy job. We're gonna free Palestine. Palestine will be freed, and it's a matter of minute. And my mother told me of a famous speech by Abdel Nasser, Jamal Abdel Nasser, Nasser of Egypt, when he said that I will let my cigarettes in Cairo, I'll put it out in Tel Aviv. It was just a walk in the park. Done deal. Nothing is gonna happen. And guess what? The battle started. Israel took the primitive actions and started the war. But prior to the wars, all the actions that took, like withdrawing the United Nations peacekeeping missions and all of that, was done by the Arabs. So the Arabs were doing the work for the war. They're the ones who getting ready for the war, declaring all the intentions for the war, till Israel took the initiative and launched the war. And according to to Arab media, within hours, we're waiting for the war. We are hungry for the war. The Arab armies are advancing to Tel Aviv. The war has started. Hooray, the war has started. We are all united. We are behind our dear leader in this war. We're gonna win the war. And Israel was so confident of what was going on the ground and didn't want a ceasefire, and that's the key word I mentioned before, didn't want a ceasefire, that Israel torpedoed US Navy ship that was observing what was going on. Because it was winning the war. It was winning everything. It demolished the... So how do you get people's attention to the conflict? Banksy drew a cat on a wall because that's what people would be interested in, so they could see the demolished background. Um, but there are things you need to know. There are a lot of things that needs to be told about this story, and it's hard to escape the reality of the struggle. One of the most important things was the culture war, and the culture war continues. A lot of people, when they think of falafel, they think, oh, that's an Israeli dish. No. When they think of hummus, that's an Israeli dish. No. Tabbouleh, that's an Israeli dish. No. That's part of the culture war. When they think of Palestinian dresses, that what the women wear as a Palestinian dress, El Al, that's the Israeli Airways, used to get their hostess in these dresses to represent like a traditional Israeli dress. That's part of the culture war. But there is an important part of the culture war hardly talked about, and that's the targeted assassination by Israeli forces, the Mossad, of Palestinian intellectuals from the early 70s, commissioned by Golda Meir, the then Prime Minister of Israel, and before 1974 Munich operation, the Palestinian poets, Palestinian writers were killed, assassinated by Israeli forces. Why they were killing the writers? Why they're killing the poets? Because they want people to forget. That was the aim, and that's part of the culture war. Remove all things about this Palestinian identity. Because the idea is the old people will die, the young people will forget. The old people will die, the young people will forget. So if you're young, that's your choice. Do you want to forget? Do you want to forget oppression? Do you want to forget injustice? Because the old people, most of them have died. And trust me, the young Palestinians have not forgotten.